anyway, so that's fine. So just a bit of context, really, I suppose, to go back to why Forest School developed and where it came from. So Forest School has been around for a while now, for over 20 years, and it started off, I suppose, in a bit of a response to what was going on, not just within the UK, but sort of globally, the sort of disconnect really between children particularly and the natural environment. So just thinking in terms of context, I suppose, there's a few bits and pieces on the screen here, just looking at sort of, well, what goes on for children, what does a sort of typical childhood look like sort of today. So there's a little funny map at the top right corner there, and that shows over 4 generations how the freedom to roam and move around for children aged, they were aged 8, weren't they? Yeah, over 4 generations, how that changed over those 4 generations, from great-grandfather who was allowed to go off for a good walk on his own, so this is without adults, to go fishing, down to the son today who's only really allowed to the end of his street. So it just gives you a sense. Obviously Sheffield would have developed over that time phase, so it skews it a little bit, but it gives you that sense of sort of the freedom of movement. And typically that trend has been seen globally, not just in the UK. So children's freedom to move around, go to natural spaces, play, do things like fishing, cycling, whatever, has shrunk over the generations. Obviously, the amount of traffic on our roads has gone up. You know, that's kind of just a fact of life over the last 30, 40 years, gone up massively. So it sort of feels like the roads are busier and more dangerous. And we're in a bit of a feedback loop there, really, where parents that want to send children to school independently get worried about sending them because the roads seem busy. So the children have to cross roads or they have to cycle. And then more and more parents are then bringing children in cars to school. So we're sort of stuck in a bit of a loop there. And obviously, other thing that's, well, a couple of things that have changed has been screen time. You know, it's a fact of life. The amount of screen time has gone up, not just for children, for all of us. You know, we're all using our screens, whether it's phones. And not to say screen time is bad, because it's not. It's just about that's expanded and therefore other things have shrunk. And sort of a health and safety culture, I guess, you know, thinking about, there's been some interesting stories over the years about schools banning conkers because it's so dangerous, you know, they have to wear PPE. So things like that often get talked up in the press, and actually the impact from it being reported has more of an impact on schools than what's actually going on. So other schools see, oh, it's actually dangerous to play conkers, I haven't got time to think about it, so we'll have to just ban conkers. Whereas actually a lot of these stories start quite innocently and no one is actually banning conkers. Okay, so moving on. So just thinking about the time we all have, that children have in a given day, it's a fixed, you know, there's a fixed amount of time there. And obviously time in nature is the thing. Time outdoors has been squeezed over the years. So children's just ability to access being outside, parents are busy, you know, I know myself, I've got 2 boys. Sometimes it's hard to let them do what they want to do. You know, they might want to go off independently, might want to go to the park or whatever, and I'm busy cooking or doing other things, juggling stuff, and actually allowing them just to go out somewhere can be harder than you'd like it to be. So that's been squeezed as screen time and other things, playing indoors, has expanded. So someone I often refer to, there's an academic called Richard Louv, who's written a book called Last Child in the Woods. It's probably a good 15 years old now. He looked globally at this picture of the increasing disconnect between nature and children. And he talks about this well-meaning house arrest, which I can completely connect to as a parent and feel that it's really easy for that to happen without you realizing it. You sort of go, the kids might say, oh, can we go to the park? Can we do this? Can we do that? And go, oh, I'm just a bit busy. Maybe you just play inside or play in the garden. And you end up creating that sort of safe bubble. You don't really mean to, but you're sort of limiting their opportunities, I suppose, for being outside. And then that other trend, you know, when I was a kid, it was more normal for seeing kids out on the street on their own, doing chores, going to the shops, getting things, going to the park by themselves. And that is coming full circle now. I think you're seeing more of that coming back. But I think for a long time, it felt a bit odd if you saw a young child out on their own. You kind of felt a bit nervous or a bit worried for them because you thought something was wrong, whereas actually, you know, that used to be quite normal. So just, yeah, thinking about sort of what is it that's important about nature for people, for children, and what is it for us as adults? What do we want children to take away, I suppose? You know, what do we want them to experience? And David Attenborough is someone I come back to time and time again. He's had quite an impact on me personally as I've grown up with him, experiencing his nature documentaries. And he's often said that he regrets making such good nature documentaries because we're sort of tantalized into just watching them and not actually out in it. But some of the stuff, as he's got older, he's been a bit more forthright in talking about, you know, the need to address the climate crisis, the need to take action, the need for children to care and love nature. So this one's quite a nice one, that thing about, well, you know, children really need to experience nature to care about it. And that's very much what's at the heart of Forest School. So back in 1993, that was the first sort of observation, I guess, really, of nursery staff, early years staff from Bridgewater College going to Denmark and observing their early years, their sort of nature kindergarten out in Denmark. And it wasn't called Forest School, obviously. That's a term that's been, you know, coined by Bridgewater College and then has spread. But they saw young children, sort of 5-year-olds, climbing trees, lighting fires, using knives, and they got quite excited and thought, well, we don't do anything like that. That's quite exciting. But obviously there's a lot of historic background around Forest School and around where it's come from, going back to things like the scouting and guiding movement, other approaches to outdoor learning across Scandinavia, then environmental education in the 70s and 80s. So there's a lot of context there, and things like Joseph Cornell and Earth Education particularly feed into the typical sorts of activities you might see on Forest School. And there's been a variety of organisations involved with the development of Forest School, Forestry Commission, various outdoor education groups as well. And then the Forest School Association was properly set up in 2012. So there's a national voice, volunteer-led, small charity organisation that speaks out for Forest School and tries to encourage its development more widely. So what's the sort of key components really of Forest School? So it took a bit of time in the first 10 years for practitioners to decide on what are the key components really. So it's not about the activities, it's not about we always have to have fires, it's not about we have to climb trees or build dens. It's about the experience and it's about the range of opportunities. So Forest School typically includes free play. It needs to have a component of sort of wild spaces, and by wild spaces I don't mean like a full-on jungle. I mean you need some corners that aren't sort of heavily maintained like a garden or a park. You need some bits of sort of, you know, brambly bits and some bits that are sort of going a bit wilder. The process of Forest School needs to be quite holistic and quite broad in the learning sort of that you're aiming to achieve. It shouldn't be like a lesson. It should be more rounded, I suppose, in like free play, as I was saying, supporting learning and development and following children's interests. And a big component for me of Forest School is sharing. And again, we'll look at some slides on that. So how does that happen? What does that look like? And there should be an element of risk. So pushing back against that culture of bubble wrapping children and people and reducing all risk. There should be an element of risk because we learn through risk and we learn through taking kind of calculated risks every day. Now's the time to have quite a big conversation about that with what's going on more generally. But it's wrapping our head around what does that mean? What are the benefits of experiencing, you know, low levels of risk, but elements of risk. And Forest School also is a long-term experience. So it's not a one-off. It's not a, let's just go to the woods for the day. That's great. And that's really good. You know, schools do trips out to the woods and that's great, but that's not really Forest School. And it should be supportive. You know, the learners should be supporting each other. The adults should be supporting the learners. And just slightly going back, I sort of mentioned that that Bridgewater College's nursery staff developed this sort of original version of Forest School, and that was with early years groups. But now Forest School kind of crosses the whole age boundary, so it works with that approach is used with adult groups, family groups, children, all sorts of different groups. And I've certainly had experience of leading those sorts of groups, and I think you can tailor all these sorts of experiences to, you know, with adult groups. I was working with an adult group today up at Southmead Hospital, and the focus there is very much on well-being and on mindfulness, you know, so there's sort of different focus depending on the group. So making the most out of the setting you're in is key. And sometimes you've got a great space with hills. I love hills and slopes. Great. Lots of dead bits of wood and old rotten trees. Amazing. But you don't always get that. You don't always get that, or streams to swing across. Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you're dealing with more of a flat school grounds or a park type situation, and then you've got to hunt out smaller scale, the little corners that are a bit wilder and a bit more interesting. And it's how you can support the creative play and learning that children instinctively want to do. You know, can you direct their play or guide their play in a way that is beneficial for them as individuals, but also beneficial for them as a group? Because sometimes you might have a child that wants to do something where you're not quite sure whether you can support it, but sometimes maybe you can redirect it. As an example of a boy here wanting to throw sticks down a slope, and there was a path at the bottom. We were like, well, we don't want to chuck things that far because people might come along and you're going to lose your stick. So he came up with the idea of throwing the stick down with a rope tied onto it, and it wasn't going to go as far as the path, and then he could pull it back up, and he loved doing that for ages. And sometimes children are doing things where you need to stand back as an adult and you need to just watch what they do to try and figure out what sort of play, you know, not intervene. And the top left is a good example of that, of a boy who was playing. They were playing, they haven't beaten him with a stick and buried him in leaves. Actually, what is going on is one of the children's parents was in hospital, and they were doing a woodland hospital, and they were checking his temperature, and they were making him warm and comfortable. So that was what was going on there. So sometimes as adults, we want to interfere because we feel like we need to do our jobs, but actually sometimes we need to just watch and listen. And elements of risk, like I was talking about, sometimes children want to experience fire and they want to use knives and they want to hit things with sticks, and we need to try and look how we can support that in a suitable way, which is, you know, definitely a key part of Forest School. And like I mentioned before, the sort of group reflection and feedback's really key. A lot of circle time. Obviously, circle time looks a bit different currently, a bit more spaced out, and feels a little bit different, maybe less contact. Used to use a lot sort of the idea of a talking stick where you pass an object around to give children their voice, and everyone else is encouraged to listen, and you only talk when you've got the stick. And that's a really good tool for encouraging children just to find their voice. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 sessions, you know, to start with. They just pass the stick, so that can take a while. Obviously now we're using slightly, you know, different creative ways of passing on the sense of, oh, it's your turn to talk if you'd like to share something. So often coming back, doing an activity, come back in, share what we've experienced, you know, not just at the end, but often during the session. And like I talked about, it's a long-term process. So it's not a one-off. It's about building a relationship with a space that you go to, with the group that you're with, supporting each other, sharing different activities and experiences, and building up that confidence to really get the most out of the space. And a key part of Forest School, my starting point with Forest School really is sensory exploration. So it's using your senses, it's getting people to tune in. You know, adults and children, very much the same. When we go out into a green space, we're looking at, where do I go next? Where am I walking to? Where am I aiming for? What am I doing? And that can often get in the way of looking and seeing and smelling and touching. So a lot of activities try and focus groups in on what can we see? What can we find? What sort of activities might support us to look in more detail at what we can see, like looking at colours in more detail, and what can we smell, and taking time to be mindful and sit and listen as well. So that's a big component for me of getting groups to tune in to their spaces, just using their senses. So it's quite simple activities, sometimes matching colours and seeing what we can find that's natural that might match a colour. So giving ourselves challenges to explore textures or colours, maybe create a a natural picture on the ground. And then sometimes depriving ourselves of a sense, sometimes that can feel a bit hard and a bit challenging, but depriving ourselves of a sense, taking away sight and maybe just touching and seeing what a tree feels like, and getting different experiences of that. And taking also individual activities as well, so it might be listening or drawing, mapping sounds, that kind of thing, to really tune into what's there. And again, focusing on things like smells, which I've talked about. Common activity which is often done is finding little bits. Often with really young children, it's the kind of Room on the Broom, if you're familiar with that book, that kind of chucking things into a potion and stirring it up and seeing what you make and what it smells like and what it looks like. Sometimes with older groups, it's trying to make a natural perfume, giving it a name and letting others smell it as well. Obviously, again, at the moment, done a little bit differently. And sometimes it's really honing in on different creative activities. So it's looking at what you can make, how we can be a bit adventurous, making natural imagery on the ground, making mobiles, making jigsaws out of leaves or wild faces on cards. And then there's a lot of games as well in Forest School, kind of using mirrors to kind of see what's going on in the canopy, creeping up games, all those kind of things to really use our senses and really explore the natural setting. And Forest School is really aiming for that transition. So we're aiming from that going out in nature and having contact with it. So that's great. But we gradually want to move towards that feeling really connected to nature, and not, not just individually, but as a group as well. So we're sort of trying to make that transition, and it takes time. And you'll have some Forest School practitioners out there that will say, well, that might take months, Sometimes we only have 5 or 6 sessions with a group, and we try and get as far along with that as we can. But it's very much a sort of starting point for that journey for individuals to go on. So we need, that's the question really that we need to sort of think about, is what is it about the outdoors that's really going to be of interest for your groups? And you really need to sort of hone in on that when you're out with a group supporting it, and think about, well, is it going to be the dens and the fires, or is it going to be as much the senses and the games? And it's often challenging yourself, because you might have a thing in your mind that says, oh, they're this type of group, and so they won't want to do silly games. But actually, I've often found with working with older groups that they want to do the silly games as much as the younger groups. So don't count things out. It's often worth trying, even if you go, okay, well, that didn't really work, let's try something else. But it's important to sort of try and engage groups with a whole range of experiences that really sort of draw them into the natural